Hello and welcome back to Christie's Cozy Corner. And in today's video, I will be talking about my June reading wrap up. June was a pretty okay reading month. It's never as good as I always want it to be because I just want to get to so many different things, but alas, we do have a time constraint, and I ended up reading 10 things in June. So we're just gonna talk about them, and I'm gonna try to make them snappy. And I think I like the format that I did last month with my May reading wrap up, where I started off as like the most fantasy of fantasy, and it slowly started getting less speculative and eventually getting into contemporary and romance. So I think I'm gonna follow that going forward. We'll see, but this is how I'm gonna do it for this month. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. I love starting off talking about the ones that I love because I can just gush about them all day, and I am freaking obsessed with Gideon and this book. Obviously, I gave it 5 stars. It was one that I was a little bit worried about when I was going in because I've heard so many mixed things about it. Like, some people absolutely love it and other people who just really didn't jive with it at all. And I was really worried that I was going to be one of those people who just didn't connect with it. But oh boy, did I connect with it. Oh, the writing and the characters and the aesthetic and the atmosphere. Everything just worked so well. I don't know what else there is to say. So this book is about our main character, Gideon, who is like an indentured servant to what they're called the Ninth House, like in this solar system. By the way, this is classified as a sci-fi, but I feel like it's more of a fantasy, but just in like a space kind of setting. But it's not even like set in space. It's just on a different planet. Like, I really just think it is more fantasy. But anyway, so in the solar system, there are these 9 planets, and on each of these planets, they're ruled by a different house, and Gideon is on the 9th house. And the 9th house is ruled by our other character, Harrow Hark, Nona Jezimazim something. So each of the necromancers in the house get an invitation to compete in this kind of trial for their king or their god to become one of his lictors. But each necromancer has to bring with them their guard or their cavalier. And somehow Gideon gets roped up into doing that. So this book is really about this trial that happens between these houses and just them trying to figure out like what is the purpose of this entire competition, like what they're even supposed to be doing, and also trying to figure out some of the mysteries that happen during it. So I know the tagline is lesbian necromancers in space, but honestly, like, that is so inaccurate and just gives people the wrong idea going in because only one of them is a necromancer and it's hardly set in space at all. I would definitely pitch this more as a game / competition / mystery with a royal and guard trope of lesbian. Although there really isn't any kind of romantic subplot at all, they just both happen to be lesbians. Anyway, yeah, I just really loved everything about this book. I especially love Gideon. She is so funny. The writing, I know, is one of those things that people don't always jive with because it is written in a humorous way, but you know, humor doesn't always land the right way for a lot of different people. And one thing that I will say about the writing though is that it is a little bit overwritten in a sense where it's like, you know, you're reading it and the sentence could just stop right there, but it keeps going, in my opinion, in a funny way. I don't know how a lot of other people might read it, but to me, it's very reminiscent of when I used to read fan fiction. Like, if you've read fan fiction and you know fan fiction writing, then you know what I'm talking about. And if not, then it's really hard to explain, like, what is fan fiction writing. But it just worked really well for me. And I really loved reading it, especially in Gideon's voice and her narration. Again, she's so funny. And she's also just so dumb all the time. And I especially love that everyone else is talking in this like highbrow, pretentious way. And then you have Gideon there just being like, yep, titties. Because she's just so thirsty all the time. And I love it. And like I said, the royal and guard trope, which is one of my favorite tropes, So I always love the dynamic between the characters that fall into those categories. It's just so delicious, and I eat it up every single time. And I read this book during a reading vlog, so I will link that in all the right places, so you can go ahead and check that out and see more of my thoughts about Gideon and the other 2 books that I read during that reading vlog if you like. And the next book I'll talk about is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Matar and Max Gladstone. And this one is actually a reread. I first read this book, or this novella, about 3 years ago, and I really, really loved it at the time, and I gave it 5 stars. And the same this time as well. This is one of those stories where you go into it really not knowing anything and just like have no idea what's going on, but it slowly starts to piece itself together, and everything just makes a lot of sense by the end of it. So it's a really good book to reread. And of course, I was influenced to pick this back up and read it again by the one and only Bigelows Dickolas. And it was also just like the perfect thing to read during Pride Month, because this one is also kind of a sci-fi about lesbian robots, kind of. Like, they're not really robots, but yeah, they're like enemy spies who work for their own organizations and try to thwart each other in different historical events. Like, they'll travel back to make sure that one certain thing has happened, so then, hundreds or even thousands of years down the line, something else happens as a result because of the initial thing that they made sure either happened or didn't happen. So that's like the basic premise of this book, but it's really about the love story between these 2 characters and the letters that they write to each other. Oh God. Like, when I said that Guns of the Dawn had some of the most romantic lines that I have ever read, this book had some of the other most romantic lines that I have ever read. And it was just so beautiful. And the writing, the language is so lyrical and metaphoric and flowery. So, if those are your anti-buzzwords, then probably don't read this book, because it is really heavy on the imagery. And there were a lot of times where I was reading it and I'm just like, I really have like no idea what any of this means, or like how to even picture some of this stuff, but I'm just here for the ride. And I loved it. I gave it 5 stars again. It was so good. And the next book I read is The Lives of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, which I gave 4.5 stars. Now this one, I really, really loved it, but at the same time, I'm also just a little bit tiny disappointed, because I was so sure that it was going to be a full 5 stars, and the first half was just a complete 5-star through and through. But things did take a slight downturn in the second half, just from the way like some of the reveals happened and how some of the events played out. It ended up being a 4.5, which is still really good. Like, I still really loved this book and enjoyed my time reading it. I just wanted it to be a complete 5 stars from cover to cover. And unfortunately, that wasn't it. So I don't know if I can count this as like a disappointing read. Like, it's definitely not disappointing. It's really, really good. And I would say it definitely lives up to all the hype that it gets, because I think this is like one of the most hyped fantasy books. Anyway, this is about our character, Locke Lamora, who is a gentleman bastard thief. So he's like a con artist who dresses up like someone above his station and steals money from like nobles and stuff. And this is about him and his crew of other gentleman thieves and these heists that they go on. But it's also just so much more than just a heist story, and it's set in this city where there's nobles and there's criminals and everything is really corrupt, and Locke and his crew are just kind of trying to navigate through all of these politics as they conduct their thievery. And that's all I will say about the plot. What really came alive for me in this book is the characters and their friendship and their dynamic, but also the world and the writing. I really, really enjoyed the writing. It kind of had this funny, cheeky kind of style and just so many laugh out loud moments. And Locke himself is just like this snotty little brat, and I love him. Like, okay, I know he's technically in his like mid-20s during the current timeline that we're following, because this is told in flashbacks between the current timeline and in the past when he was much younger. But for some reason, every time I read this, I just still kept picturing them as teenagers, just because like they're just such bros, you know? I think because of that. So just love Locke. and Jean and the twins and Bug. I love them. I love them. Oh, and this is also one of the books that I read in that reading vlog as well. And speaking of, the next book that I'll talk about is another book that I read during that reading vlog, and that is Senlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft. And I also just realized that all three of the books that I read in the reading vlog feature characters whose names are in the title. Anyway, so this book is about our main character, Senlin, or Thomas Senlin, who is the headmaster of this really small school in this small fishing village, and it's always been his dream to visit the illustrious Tower of Babel, which he has just built up in his mind as this grand, magnificent thing, and he teaches about it to his students as well. So he finally gets a chance to go there on his honeymoon with his new wife, Maria, and very quickly realizes that it is nothing like what he imagined. And they get separated because that's just kind of what the tower does. And now he has to try to climb the tower to find her because he can't find her anywhere else. And it's unlikely that she would have went home because she has no money. So I ended up giving this a 3.75 stars. I think I accidentally said I gave it a 3.5 at the end of the reading vlog, but it's more of a 3.75. And I really like the writing of this book. It just had this really whimsical, dreamlike kind of quality that just really sucks you in and immerses you in this world. And I love the world itself as well, and the tower. Everything about it was so fascinating. I feel like for me, Senlin was the weakest part of this book because I just didn't really care about him all that much and his journey to find Maria. Like I mentioned in the reading vlog, stories that are just about middle-aged men trying to reconnect with their wives just don't land for me. It just does nothing for me on a personal, emotional level. But I love to see him exploring the tower because it is just so bizarre, like all the different mechanics of it. And each floor of the tower is like its own completely separate world. And each time he goes into one, he kind of has to try to figure out like how this one works and try to navigate it. And I just found it so cool and so interesting. So I'm going to continue on reading this series, but more of so to see more of this world and also some of the other characters that we meet who I am much more invested in than Senlin himself, sorry to say. But yeah, this series is one of the series that I've been wanting to get to for a while, so I'm really glad to have finally gotten around to reading it. And the next book is Dark Currents by Lindsay Buroker, which is the second book in the Emperor's Edge series, which is one of my favorite series, and I've been doing a reread of it. And I will push this series on anyone and everyone because I just love it so much. It's got such nice found family dynamics and one of the best slow burn romances I have ever read. And the tone is very lighthearted and funny and just overall entertaining. So, if you're ever looking for like a light, quick, easy read, then consider checking this one out, like in case you're bogged down by all the really heavy fantasies and just need a quick pick-me-up. So this book is about our main character, Amaranth Lockton, who is an enforcer or kind of like a police officer in this empire. And she gets mistakenly roped up in this plot to kill the emperor and ends up with a bounty on her head. So the plot of this whole series is her trying to clear her name and exonerate herself. And she teams up with this assassin who is also kind of roped up in this somehow to try to help her with that, and also just recruits like a bunch of other people on the way, and they form this bond, this found family. It's just so funny. I love all of the characters. I love Amaranth especially. She very much reminds me of Amy Santiago from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, not only because most of the time they wear their hair in a tight bun, but also just because they're so cleanly and fastidious all the time and just keep everyone else in line. And I feel like she's just a really strong female protagonist because she'll get herself in all sorts of trouble, but she doesn't need rescuing all the time. Like, there are some moments where you're thinking like, oh my god, like how is she going to get out of the situation? And you're kind of expecting that, okay, like something will happen or someone will come in, swoop her and save her, but she uses her brain and she figures out how to get out of it herself, and I love that. So this book, Dark Currents, I ended up giving a 3.5 stars on reread. I do feel like it is one of the weaker ones in this series because each book, at least in the beginning of the series, follows its own crime of the week mystery, and I didn't really care for the mystery in this book too much. I mostly just read this for the characters, you know? And the next two books that I'll talk about is the Monk and Robot duology, the first book being A Song for the Wild-Billed, and the second one being A Prayer for the Crown-Shy by Becky Chambers. This duology was just so lovely, and I picked it up at the exact right time. Like, I feel like this is just something that I really needed to read right now, and I'm actually so sad that it's only 2 books, but at the same time, like, where it ended up in A Prayer for the Crown-Shy, I'm like, okay, you know what? This is the right place for it to end and for where our characters to be. Like, I'm okay with it just ending here. This book is set in a world where machines have gained sentience and humans gave them the choice of whether to continue to live with humanity and be given equal rights or to leave altogether, and the robots ended up choosing to leave. So humans have kind of had to try to live their lives after that and adapt to that. And I think this is set like a few hundred years after that initial incident. And it's about our main character named Dex, who is a tea monk who travels around from village to village. They set up their table and brew a tea, and people will come to them and talk about whatever problems or issues that they're having at the moment. And Dex will brew a specific kind of tea for them that will help them in that situation, to help them relax and just like, you know, de-stress. And one day Dex decides that they don't really want to do this anymore, so they go off into the wild and they end up meeting a robot named Mosscap. And it's about the robots coming back and wondering, you know, like, how have the humans been doing since their departure, and is there anything particularly that the human race needs at the moment? So it's just a lot of conversations around this topic, and it gets pretty heavy on the philosophy, but I feel like in a really interesting way. And this is a series of novellas, so they're really short, but there was never a moment where I felt like, oh my god, like, you know, like, it's too much philosophy. And I also just love the lessons that it departs on you as well. Like how not everything has to have a purpose, and the way you live your life is not meaningless in any way just because you don't have like a goal or are super ambitious. Like, just you existing as yourself is enough. And it just warmed my heart. So yeah, I feel like I just read this in the right time in my life because that is something that I have struggled with myself from time to time. So it's just nice to like be seen, you know, in this kind of text and realize you're not the only one who's going through these struggles, and everyone else is going through the same struggles as well. And, you know, we're all just humans trying to live, you know? And the next book that I read is A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. And this is my second T. Kingfisher read, and I definitely plan to read a lot more of her because her writing just really works for me. It's just so witty and also just like really casual and fun, and it really feels like you're just talking to a friend. Like a friend is telling you the story. It's just like, you know, you're with a friend, you meet up at a coffee shop, and you're just like, oh, hey, you know, like, what's been going on with you? Like, tell me everything. Let's catch up. And they're like, oh my God, like, let me tell you, like, what I've been going through, like, the past few months. And that's exactly how I felt while I read this book, which is about our main character, Samantha, who is a paleoentomologist. So she studies ancient species of insects, which I found so cool. And she moves back in with her mother for a while, and her mother has not been doing so well lately. Like, she's had a complete personality shift, and so Samantha and her siblings were like wondering, like, you know, what's happening with their mom? Is she okay? Is she going through possibly like early onset signs of dementia? And the house may or may not be involved, and it just goes from there. I just love Samantha as a character. She was just so relatable. And normally when you read like horrors and thrillers, I feel like the characters are always the weakest part, or they're like just the worst human beings ever. So it's really like not an enjoyable experience to be following them around and being in their heads. But what I love about T. Kingfisher's book is that, you know, they're like, I feel like the best way to describe it is like a cozy horror. Because yeah, it does get scary sometimes, but you really like the characters and you're actually rooting for them. Because I feel like in other horrors, I'm just like, I don't give a crap what happens to any of these characters because they're all just horrible human beings anyway. But in this one, I was pretty invested in Samantha and her mom's relationship. Also, their mother and daughter dynamic is just so lovely, and I love to read like healthy family dynamic. Oh, I definitely like to read the toxic ones too, but I feel like we don't get to see the healthy ones as much. So that was just really nice to read in this one. And I gave this book overall 4 stars, just a really solid read. And the next book I read is Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, which I gave 4 stars, and I'll just keep this one short because I also did a dedicated review for this one, so I'll leave that link down below if you want to hear more of my thoughts on this one. But this book, in a very condensed kind of summary, is about our character June, who is an author, but she's not doing so well, and her friend Athena Liu has been a massive success. But Athena dies one day and leaves behind an unpublished manuscript that only June knows about. So June ends up stealing it and publishing it under her own name. And this book is very much about the Chinese culture, so she ends up publishing it under a racially ambiguous name that makes it seem like she also could be Chinese. So it's a lot going on, and I really like this because of how compulsively readable it was, and just to see how much worse this woman can get, because in her mind, really, like, she isn't doing anything wrong, and it's just so fascinating being in her brain to see her try to justify all these things to herself. And it just touches on so many interesting conversations about the publishing industry and racism, and it's also not just a black and white conversation, which I found really fascinating because there's like multiple sides to the story, and it's really interesting to see it from a different perspective. But I feel like this is also one of those books where it's not going to work well for a lot of people because of how meta and current it is in the topics that it talks about. And also, probably the more you know about the publishing industry and how everything works, the less you're going to enjoy it, because it will require like a lot of suspension of disbelief on your part. Myself, however, I don't really know that much about publishing, so when I read it, I was just like, oh my god, like all of this is crazy. So yeah, I really like this book, and I'm so glad because I have had such a rocky relationship with R.F. Kuang in some of her past books, which I really, really liked, but I also had a lot of issues with it. However, this one I feel like is very solid. I really enjoyed my time reading it. I didn't really have that many issues. So yeah, it just made me feel like, you know, I'm definitely going to keep reading R.F. Kuang. And finally, the last book that I'll talk about in my June wrap-up is Twisted Hate by Anna Huang. So as I said, we went from the most fantasy to the least fantasy. So this is a contemporary romance. So this is the 3rd book in the Twisted series by Anna Huang, and this whole series is about this group of 4 friends and each of their own individual love lives and relationships. And this book follows, I forget her name, Jules, who is the best friend of Ava, the main character in the 1st book, and about Jules's relationship with Josh, who is Ava's brother. And this one, as the name suggests, Twisted Hate, they hate each other. They never got along. Jules thinks that Josh is too overprotective of Ava, and Josh thinks that Jules is a bad influence on Ava. So there's a lot of tension between these 2 characters, but they kind of end up working in the same company, so they are forced to try to be civil towards one another, at least at work. And they end up forming a kind of bond, so it's very like hate to love. And I think this book might be the most divisive in the series based off of the reviews that I've seen other people give on this book versus the other previous books. But I think this one is actually my favorite because I love the dynamic between these 2 characters. Like, ooh, the tension and the angst, like, just give it all to me. However, I do see where some people might have had a lot of issues with it, especially when it came to the 3rd act breakup. Like, Josh was really kind of a jerk. And what he did is like verging on the unforgivable, but you know, I kind of just choose to look past it. It's a romance, like whatever. And I still end up really liking these 2 characters together. So I gave this one a 4 stars, which I was pleasantly surprised with. But one thing that I will say about Anna Huang's books, and I know like she writes alpha males, like that's her thing, right? But they all just feel like the same character sometimes. Like this is written in dual perspective, 1st person, which I really don't like, by the way. Like, I don't like being in the male love interest head. I just feel like it takes away from the sense of mystery, and I don't know, I just don't really enjoy it. And especially in this one, in this series, where you're in the male character's head and they all just sound the same. Like, they're all super possessive and they want to do harm to any other man that comes within any close proximity to the female main character. And it just gets really tiring and really old. And I'm like, can we do something else, please? Like, it's just so unnecessary. It's so unnecessary. So yeah, those are all the 10 things that I read in the month of June. And if you watched my May wrap-up, you might be wondering, or you might not, like, who really cares? Where was the next Mistborn Era 2 book? Because I said I will be reading one of those a month. And I am currently reading Shadows of Self. So like I said, I'm reading them like, once a month. And I started it in June. So technically, it counts. So yeah, for July, right now, I am working on Shadows of Self by Brandon Sanderson. I'm also working on Harrow the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, the book right after Gideon. And I have a few other things coming up. July is definitely an ambitious reading month for me, so let's hope that I can get to everything that I plan to get to. So let me know down in the comments if you read any of the books that I talked about today and what you thought of them. And that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in my next one. Bye!